morning, and welcome to this week's episode of Heads Up, a show that focuses on mental wellness. I'm retired school counselor Sue Mullen, and with me this morning is my co-host, licensed family therapist, Diane Vaccarello. Good morning, Diane.
Good morning. How are you?
I am great, and I want you to know how happy I was to find a text from you first thing this morning. Telling me how excited you are to do this week's episode, which is going to focus, I think part one of this topic actually is going to focus on being your authentic self. So I did what every good investigative reporter would do. I Googled the authentic self.
Fantastic.
To see what would come up. And there is a boatload of information on the internet about being authentic. So I can't wait to hear the Diane Vaccarello version of what it means to be your authentic self. Take it away.
Fantastic. So yes, I woke up this morning and I cannot wait to talk about being real, about being authentic. It's something that I feel like at a mental health level, at a psychological wellness and physical wellness level, it's definitely the direction that we need to head. And we need to teach our kids how to do this through our own understanding of what it means to be authentic as parents and as adults in this world. And I think adults will get a lot out of it because we never really stop growing in this area, is my belief, that we can continue to reinforce what our authentic self is in all sorts of ways. Every single day, we can reinforce it, or we can sort of pull away from that. And the pulling away from that is really very much tied to the angst around anxiety and depression, which is a lot of what we've spoken about in previous episodes. So it's a nice complement to that.
All right. So give me a definition. I'm going to see, we're going to play, see how close Diane can get to the Google.
Fantastic.
Give me a definition of what the authentic self actually is.
Well, I think the cool part about this is that we all need to kind of come up with our own definition of what authenticity means to us. Mm-hmm. But I will give you some general sense of the idea that being authentic, living authentic, is our core true self. It is being real. It is coming from a place where we have given some thought to what we actually think. Mm-hmm. You know, we living in our society, we're born into a world, I think our natural state, our alpha state is sometimes what it's referred to. And that natural self, kids, in other words, who are young, are most really connected to their authentic self than sometimes adults are. In other words, we don't have to work that hard for it when we are just born into this world. But as we go along, things can pull us away from our authentic self. So the idea of this is, how as adults can we reconnect with what's been in there the whole time?
Okay, now I'm going to tell you what the Google says.
Okay.
Google says that to be authentic means knowing yourself, being genuine, self-authored, which I thought was an interesting descriptor. Knowing what you can and cannot change. Mm-hmm. That was interesting.
Very.
And basically knowing what your own beliefs, values, personal traits, your own strengths and weaknesses, kind of being able to take a long view of yourself as a person.
Exactly. A long view and a deep dive into what that is. Mm-hmm. We don't always give ourselves time to actually process and think and assess what that is. So sometimes, we're born into families, right? And so the family itself has its own culture of values and all of these things that you mentioned. We are within a society that has its own set of rules and values as well. So if we could talk today about the authentic self and the adaptive self, these are the two areas
That's right here, the adaptive self.
Excellent. Sometimes it's also called the redesigned self. There's all sorts of words for it, but it's ultimately around the idea that throughout our growing up years that are very formative, our childhood years, we are taught how to behave. We're taught sometimes what to think, all sorts of things come into play. And we have to eventually get through to our teenage years. Let me start by saying, as children, it's essential that we adapt to our environment, right? So that we can have a sense of safety and belonging. That sense of belonging is super strong. We're social creatures. And so that sense of belonging sometimes guides our adaptive self, meaning we have to come up with different adaptations in order to stay belonging with our tribe, with our group.
Let me ask you this. Mm-hmm. Are we born as blank slates? I mean, how much of us is sort of pre-programmed traits that are affected by genetics? What exactly is that sort of original self?
So here's where, you can read a lot of contradicting information to this or supporting information to this. In all of my professional career and personal experience, I come from a family of 5 different kids from the same set of parents. So I'm integrating obviously my worldview in this answer, but I would definitely say it's both nature and nurture. We are born with certain genetic coding as well. So there's a physiological, biological component. I don't think that we're blank slates in that sense. Mm-hmm. So there's a biological piece. And obviously the nature is very strong. We are informed by our environment and by interpersonal relationships. And so we acquire all sorts of information. Some of this information is really, really helpful for us. And we have an adaptive sort of response to it. But some of the information we don't need to carry on forever. We just need it temporarily to get through certain situations, but we don't need it in the long run. So there's certain adaptations that we need to sort of expire and say, hey, that worked for us before, but it's not really working for us currently. So let's just leave that one by the wayside and say thanks for the help.
So some of these things are kind of what we would consider, you referred to the nature part. So some of them, whether or not you're a good sleeper, whether or not you're a picky eater, whether or not you have high or low energy levels.
Exactly. Personality.
Yeah. So those are the kinds of things that we think about when we're welcoming a new child to us and looking at them and saying, not only, gee, I hope he doesn't have my nose, but also I hope he doesn't have my anxiety, my
temperament, so I think because it's a combination, we need to focus on the idea that we adapt to our environment in a survival type of way, again, to reinforce a sense of belonging. That's very critical for psychological well-being and quite literally survival, right? So then as we move into adolescence, part of the goal is to form an identity, because as kids, young kids, we are only able to survive by depending on our parents or whoever is around us for caregivers. And then as adolescents, our goal is to differentiate from our parents, from our system, from our caregivers, and start to depend on ourselves. But we have to kind of figure out, hey, what do I think about this? What do I like? That's why adolescents try on all sorts of things. It's helpful to try on all sorts of things because that's usually the more direct pathway to figuring out what works for me and what doesn't work for me. So you have to check in with your body and say, is this like what's going on right now? Am I ignoring that? And am I pushing away from that? Is that a costume that you try on lots of costumes and you figure out which one actually connects. If we don't figure that out, we run the risk of continuing to use our adaptive self in order to feel like we belong, or in order to feel like that's the only way we can be successful. But if we get to our authentic self along the way, then we can sort of like have a lot less anxiety around all sorts of things. But if we're using our adaptive self and we can't genuinely figure out what our authentic self is because we're getting distracted by all sorts of influence, then we run the risk of having a little, midlife crisis, existential crisis, all sorts of things can come up.
Right. Okay. So what does the authentic self look like? I mean, I think that people have all kinds of different ideas of what it means to be real, or so I'm sort of intrigued by like whether or not there are building blocks or a foundational basis for the authentic self.
There are definitely guidelines, I would say, in terms of bringing ourselves into that space. And part of it is being truthful to ourselves first and foremost, but definitely to other people as well. If we are not being truthful, even tiny little lies that might seem insignificant will start to sort of counteract that authentic self feeling. And we'll basically, what we're telling ourselves is showing our real self or a real opinion or a real thought on the matter is going to cause us some risk perhaps, or that we just can't quite, that we're not good enough actually, and that judgment around us not being good enough comes out in this sense of lying. And if we subscribe to that over and over without doing something about it, then we start slipping back into an adaptive or a persona self.
Right. I'm kind of fascinated by your use of the term lying, because I think that when we consider the aspect of lying, we think about it as being intentional. Like people don't tell the truth. People know they're not telling the truth. They just choose not to tell the truth.
Right.
But when you're talking about lying from an emotional point of view, I mean, sometimes, right, that means holding your opinion and not speaking your truth. Sometimes it means being what we refer to as a people pleaser.
Exactly.
In that you're kind of hiding what it is that you think and feel and deferring to somebody else. Yes.
Exactly. Yes. And that deferring to somebody else sort of, again, sets up this messaging back to yourself that your opinion isn't valid, or that the other person's opinion is more important. I mean, opinions are just opinions, right? The thing is that it can come in very subtle ways, and you could be very comfortable in your living room, for example, and somebody can, send you a message and say, hey, I was wondering if you, wanted to do X, Y, or Z. And the internal subtle angst around the idea, if you say yes, when you actually really don't want to do that, it doesn't mean you don't want to be with that person, maybe, or maybe you don't. But if you say yes, and you actually really, really genuinely don't want to do that, those are the tiny little inconsistencies, incongruities that can lead to other layers of incongruity. And of course, again, we want to belong. We want a sense of, being included. And so that's why it's a constant sort of understanding of what is most important to you in those moments, and being honest.
So the goal, I mean, if we look at the sort of the goal of being your authentic self, a number of things come to mind for me. So the goal is to be genuine. The goal is to own your own opinions, feelings, thoughts. The goal is to be able to look at things realistically and accept the fact that you, me, everyone has strengths and weaknesses,
imperfections,
flaws, right?
Yeah, because if we act as if somebody else doesn't, or we act as if we don't, or we grow children into adults who think that they can't show that, and if we as adults don't show that, with our kids, then there is an acquired belief system that the goal is to be sort of perfect, never make mistakes, not show the flaws and that kind of thing. But if we can integrate and realize that, yeah, there are all sorts of imperfections. We're perfectly imperfect, and that is okay and it's acceptable. Then we can have a genuine, authentic relationship with someone because they genuinely, authentically accept us for who we are. Then we're golden. We've got both merged together. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It makes sense. It's just, it seems like a very daunting task to get there. What is it? What interferes with our ability to be this way?
So early on, if we go from, along the life cycle stage, we can, I'm just coming up with a very subtle example of how we have to balance this, and it is challenging because we live in society. So we could have a scenario where parents are saying, okay, hurry up and eat your snack, or we need to eat the snack now so we can get in the car and get to where we're going. This is where I feel like COVID has helped a little bit. We don't have quite the rush to get to a certain place at a certain time. Of course, we still do with some things, but maybe not as much with others for a tiny period of time. So we end up saying, eat your snack, and then we'll hop in the car. And then the idea is to set it up all successful, right? The kids have gone to the bathroom, their stomach is full, because if we're hungry, angry, lonely, tired, right, that we kind of are more at risk for sort of other things affecting us. So we try and set it up for success. Along the way, there's all sorts of things that happen where we're basically sometimes saying to a child, eat because we need to go, as opposed to eat because you feel hungry. Your body isn't hungry. It's not telling you you're hungry. But if we start eating because we have to organize around this other thing, we start to lose track of our connection with our body. Just a small, tiny little seed that gets planted, right? But as adults across the lifetime, if we are then we've had a long day, we're up at night, and we start eating because we're actually not hungry, but we're understimulated by our job or by a certain relationship or whatever. And we're actually eating because the texture, the color, it creates dopamine in our brain. Again, we're connecting to something biological in a sense. It's a feel-good hormone, but it's not hunger, right?
So I'm having this ding, ding, ding moment in my head right now.
Yeah.
And it goes like this. No, little Diane, you're not hungry. No, little Diane, you're not afraid. You're not lonely. It's the denial of your state.
Yes. And all sorts of things can come into that fold, right? And we start questioning, oh, all right, I thought that's what that was, but I guess it's not. And so we can go down these pathways. So when we're raising children into adults, we're wanting to see through their eyes as much as we can. We want to find out and connect with our kids and our adult relationships and all sorts of relationships. What is coming through their eyes, not necessarily imploring our opinion or, as parents, we want to teach, we want to guide, we want to set up for success. At the same time, we need to find a way of doing that while not necessarily telling somebody constantly how they think and feel, especially how they feel.
Oh, we start doing it. I mean, we start ascribing motive at birth.
Yes.
Right?
Exactly.
Leave that crying baby in the crib because that baby.
Oh, you're hungry.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It must be food. It must be whatever. Oh, fascinating.
So if we can allow ourselves to create a culture where we can talk, we can be in some discomfort and we can kind of sit with it, slow it down a little bit, say, what is coming up for you? Where do you feel that in your body? Right? We can basically start to reconnect with our true self, with what it is and we can start creating a confident, secure relationship and connection with ourself, esteem wise, that we do know what works for us. That's what builds self-esteem. That's what combats depression. Depression is like a veil or a lens that comes across that actually, sets a person up to thinking that that's what the reality is.
Yeah.
And they start questioning the other things that aren't reality. And they look through that lens and say, oh yeah, I'm not that good at this. They start all sorts of I am statements.
Yeah.
And that becomes the reality. And it's really tough because it becomes like a belief system that, can become pervasive. Mm-hmm. So a lot of times with depression, it's like framing thought and reconnecting with the body long enough to help to peel that veil away and realize, oh, this is how it actually looks. You know what I mean? And how it actually feels. And when we talk about anxiety, when we are disjointed from our genuine self, it's anxiety provoking. Again, the anxiety comes from a sense of not wanting to not belong. And so when we start becoming a people pleaser and we start saying what we think people might want to hear, we're trying to, again, belong, right? When we don't want to rock the boat and we're in a space where we're just sort of like, okay, whatever you decide for food is just fine. We just don't want to make waves. But if we do that for too long and we do that in ways that are really disjointed from ourselves, we start to blend in too much. We become boring. We actually start believing or angry or resentful. Mm-hmm. All sorts of emotions come up. And even anxiety is at sort of like the root of it, because it's like a frenetic energy that is basically saying, I'm not settled in to myself right now. And we start to organize ourselves around being a different type of person. And then the panic sets in that if the people that we're trying to please are joined with that self, that persona self, mm-hmm. and they find out that that's not our real self, are they going to still love us or want to be with us? So then you have to worry that you pull that curtain away, like the Wizard of Oz, the little guy back there still cranking away, right? That he's not.
It's interesting to me because when I said our viewing audience, if they're tuning in for the first time, they don't realize that this is not a scripted show. We don't set up, but we don't even have an outline when we come into it. It's sort of, let's pick a topic and you do your thing, I do my thing. Let's go with it.
Yeah.
So when you started talking about the adaptive self, mm-hmm. My thoughts around the adaptive self this week are, how does the adaptive self show itself at work? How does it show itself in a marriage? How does it show itself in friendships? Yep. How does, because I think that this idea that there's the us behind the curtain, right? Yep. Everybody's got that internal sense of self.
Yeah.
But really the adaptation part has to do a lot with how much do we allow people to see that inner self?
Right.
And when do we start putting on costumes and hiding things or adapting things?
Right.
To somebody else?
Exactly right. And it can be, again, adaptations can be very important to have. And they've helped us out a great deal because our authentic self got hurt. It got injured. It actually did get rejected or whatever the case may be. But that adaptive self can be a development that's constructed that basically is somebody who's like super organized. I'm just saying as an example, who is, very organized and all pulled together, is acquired because they start getting positive feedback loops created and people are like, oh, wow, that's, but then it's sort of like that becomes the identity that people are attaching to. Yep. And it takes a lot of courage to have a conversation between the adaptive self and the authentic self and reassure that authentic self that I'll still be here if you need me, but I'm going to step back a little bit because I think you can step forward with this person, or you've created some different connections, like many layers in bed sheets, right? Like 800 layer per kale or 300 is better than like 100, right? Yeah. You add all these different things to create real sense of security. Let's come out with a little courage and bravery and present from your authentic self and see what happens. And I'll be here if you need me. You know what I mean? So you kind of like have to be encouraging at that level to let your real self come out.
I think this information is extremely helpful, if not eye-opening, particularly for people. I'm sure you have family members and friends who say to you, I'm just not happy, but I don't know why.
Yeah.
Like I've got what I need. You know, I have a roof over my head and food on my table, and you know, people who love me and whatever. But I can't figure out what it is, why I'm not happy. Yeah. So I think this information could be exceptionally helpful to people who find themselves in that situation.
Exactly. And seeing that as a symptom of some way of developing this a little bit further, instead of just saying, I've got all of this and I'm still not happy. What is that? Like, what is wrong with me?
Right.
And just looking at that.
Right. Right. So we are at the magical 3-minute mark. Okay. Is always when I start, you know, sort of giving you the wink and the nod. I am hoping that when we come back to continue this discussion next week, that I am able to produce for you some, you know, real life examples of when the authentic self might be getting squelched down and what kinds of things we might do about it.
That sounds fantastic.
I just want to applaud your discretion and draw the audience's attention to the fact that I've got this cat. I've got this cat on my shirt.
You really do.
And I'm sure that the audience has seen the Zoom videos of the poor attorney that didn't know how to get rid of the cat filter on Zoom. So that, and you know that part of my authentic self is that I actually own this cat.
It looks exactly like that. Yes.
Yes. And being able to say that on screen, to say, yes, I am a cat person. I love my kitties, is again relating back to this idea of authentic self, being able to own your feelings and your impressions and your opinions.
Exactly. And that we don't need to judge somebody who has a cat who really loves them and that they really love their cat. And the cat just wants to reach up sometimes and say, hey, Sue.
Right. So, right. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. All right. Do you have any other assignments for me as we move forward?
No, I'd like us to, I'm happy to share some real life examples. I think that would be fantastic. And I'd also like us to each come up with some of our own thinking along the lines of how have we come to understand our own authentic selves, because I think each journey is its own customized approach. And I really am curious if you have anything to share about that.
Oh, I have loads to share, because in preparing myself to meet with you this morning, I realized that right now in 2021, I have real life examples of when I haven't been entirely authentic, and it makes me really anxious.
Yes.
It makes me really anxious. Okay.
Great.
Until next week. Yep. You have a good one.
Thanks, you too.
And touch base with me in between if you want. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.
Sounds good.
Time. All right, Diane. Have a good week.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
So if you're feeling lost and tired, if you're feeling uninspired,